Okay, we are going to go on to our first chapter of Unit 2. This is our Chapter 5 Integumentary System lecture. So for our first unit, chapters 1 through 4, we kind of set the scene or the background for the remainder of our chapters. So the rest of our chapters, we're going to go through system by system in terms of our body systems. So Unit 2 will start with our integumentary system, our skeletal system, and our muscular system. And we will continue through the body systems for the remainder of the class. So our integumentary system is our skin and also the accessory structures. These accessory structures include our hair, our glands, and our nails. Besides the functions that the integumentary system does, in a clinical sense, the appearance of our integumentary system or our skin can also indicate physiological imbalances in the body. So certain skin conditions can give us a hint to what is going on with our patient in a clinical sense. So the integumentary system has a few functions, protection being a big function. So we'll go through kind of piece by piece on what makes up the integumentary system. So this cross section just gives us a good look at all the different structures that make up our integumentary system, save for our nails. So the first thing I'll point out is that what we classify as the skin is the epidermis up here, our epithelial tissue, and then the dermis is this thicker layer of connective tissue, and this is where a lot of our structures are found. So the epidermis and dermis make up the skin, and then this bottom layer here is our subcutaneous tissue, so below the skin tissue, also known as our hypodermis or below the dermis, and this is mostly going to be fat tissue or adipose tissue. So our skin is also called the cutaneous membrane. It's the largest membrane in our body, but that only consists of our top two layers, the epidermis and the dermis. Some of the accessory structures to point out, we have our hair. They reside in a hair follicle. So the follicle is what contains the hair. Also connected to our hair is a sebaceous gland, which secretes a substance known as sebum or oil that lubricates our hair and skin. Our hair also has an erector pili muscle connected to it. That's what makes it stand up on end and give you the goosebumps. You see our arteries and veins, our blood supply resides within the dermis. Our nerves are in the dermis. And then we have sweat glands as well, which open all the way up to the surface. So that's one distinction between our sebaceous glands and sweat glands. Sweat glands open directly to the surface themselves. Sebaceous glands are associated with our hair and hair follicle. And we'll go through all of this again in more detail as we keep going. So our three main functions of our integumentary system are actually, we have 5 total. Our first 3, protection. So this is physical protection in terms of a cut or an abrasion, but it also protects us against ultraviolet light, and we'll talk about the cells that do that function. Sensation, of course. So we have a lot of sensory receptors. A lot of these are located within the dermis. They're known as tactile cells, and we have specific cells that detect the different types of sensation. So we'll have cells that detect temperature like heat and cold, just touch, whether that be light touch or just pressure, vibration, whether we have one thing touching us or 2 things touching us, that's called 2-point discrimination, and of course, pain. The skin is also vital for vitamin D production. So when our skin is exposed to ultraviolet light, there's a molecule produced that transforms vitamin D into its usable form. So we don't actually utilize vitamin D directly within the skin, but vitamin D is essential for our bone health, and our skin getting sunlight is the only way that we can actually process vitamin D. Our last couple, temperature regulation, we'll talk about a little more farther along. So blood flow below the skin surface, and the activity of sweat glands both help with temperature regulation. So we'll talk about that in terms of how that actually happens a little bit later on. And then secretion. So we do get rid of some waste products through our skin. And then, of course, we already talked about sweat glands and sebaceous glands, or our oil glands that are present that excrete substances. So when we actually say the skin, we're talking about our two first major tissue layers, the epidermis and the dermis. So our epidermis is going to be our superficial layer of skin. It's epithelial tissue, and it's going to more or less rest on the dermis. The dermis is a layer of dense connective tissue. So epidermis is epithelial, dermis is connective. And then the skin, or our dermis, ends up resting on our subcutaneous tissue, or our hypodermis, but that is not considered part of the skin. So we'll go over this a little bit more later. So let's start by talking about our epidermis. So our epidermis is the outer layer. It's important for protection, but it also forms almost a seal of the body. So that's going to, again, protection against abrasion, but it's also going to prevent water loss by forming that seal. So we call our epidermis the cutaneous membrane. It's made of stratified squamous epithelium, and that has become keratinized in the top layers. So we'll talk about that process here shortly. And our epidermis is composed of 5 distinct layers for a majority of our skin. Sometimes it's just 4 layers, but it's multiple layered. That's why it's stratified. So our most superficial layer is called the stratum corneum. And so this layer is actually dead cells. So at this point, our cells have filled with this substance known as keratin, or gone through the process known as keratinization. They're keratinized. And so that is a process that hardens our cells. And so all of our cells that are at the surface that are mainly protecting us are dead squamous cells. So they're just like a hardened armor. So our deepest cells that are all the way down in the basal layer, our stratum basale, those ones are going to be the cells that are alive and dividing to give us new skin cells. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get down to our diagram of the cell layers. Okay, sorry about the barking. So what happens with our epidermis is that top layer that's protecting us ends up sloughing or falling off as we get abrasions, as things rub up against us. If we get an excessive amount of this, especially on our scalp, we call this dandruff. So dust and dandruff is those extra dead cells that are falling off from being rubbed against. So our skin is subjected to friction all the time. Obviously, we're touching things, we're lifting things. Our skin is always having some kind of force affecting it. And so in certain areas where we take the most force, or where we have repetitive forces, we're going to increase the layers of our stratum corneum. It's a response to try to protect that area that's taking a lot of force and produce a thickened area, which is how we get a callus. So for those of you that lift weights or lift things in your career field often, you'll notice that you get calluses in the areas that are having the most pressure, and that's your skin's trying to protect the most vulnerable areas. And then over a bony prominence, sometimes you'll hear about a thickening, like a common one is a big toe joint, where someone will get a corn, and those sometimes can be quite uncomfortable. So the dermis itself, I'm sorry, I thought we had an image of the epidermis. Let me pop back up to this one to go back over that. Sorry to backtrack a bit. So this image here shows our multiple layers of the epidermis. So look at, like I said, there's 5 total layers. This stratum lucidum, some skin that's not quite as thick will not have this layer. So we have our stratum basale. So this is our basement layer, or our basal layer. This is our basement membrane where things are connecting down to the dermis. And so this is where our cells are going to be actively dividing. So these cells are going through the process of mitosis. As we produce more cells, they start pushing up. We have cells up here that are now considered keratinocytes because they're getting hardened even though they're still alive. And then once we get all the way up to the top, now we're going to have dead cells that are just forming that protective layer. So if you're going to remember any layers, remember the stratum corneum, that's our dead epithelial cells, dead squamous cells, they're dead keratinocytes, they're hardened, they're just for protection. And then down here at our stratum basale or our basal layer, that's where our new cells are alive and dividing. Okay, moving on to our second layer, the dermis. This is going to be dense collagenous connective tissue. So this tissue contains fibroblasts, adipocytes, and macrophages. It also, like we pointed out earlier, has all of our other structures like nerves, hair follicles, some of our smooth muscle, glands, and lymph vessels. And our collagen fibers within the dermis are going to be oriented kind of all over the place. And we're also going to have some elastic fibers that help it give it additional structure and resistance to stress. So dermal papillae, these are our kind of what you can think of as hills. So let me zoom in again. So these little bumps here are our dermal papillae. So one is a dermal papilla, multiple are dermal papillae. And so it kind of helps the dermis and epidermis fit together like a puzzle piece. And it also contains many blood vessels. So this is where a lot of our hair cells are going to enter the dermis because they can get nutrients from the blood supply to the papilla. So we have dermal papillae in our hands and the soles of our feet, as well as the tips of our fingers. And they're arranged in these parallel curving ridges. And so that's what shapes our fingerprints and footprints is the organization of these papilla. So that's kind of just a fun fact. Okay, skin color. We mentioned this in one of our first slides that skin color gives us multiple hints on what's going on with someone. So let's talk about normal skin color first. And so what determines skin color is pigments in the skin, our blood circulating through the skin, and then how thick that stratum corneum layer is in a certain area. So we have two primary pigments in our skin. We have melanin and keratin. Melanin is our primary pigment. It's our darker pigment. It can be a red, but usually a brown or a blackish, real dark color. And so that's responsible for most of the coloring of our skin, our hair, and our eyes. Keratin, on the other hand, is more of a yellowish orange pigment. So it's not surprising that it's found in veggies like squash and carrots that share the same color. As I said, most melanin's brown to black. Some can be a yellow or a red. So the color of the melanin that your skin produces is, of course, going to affect color. And the melanin is there to protect us against ultraviolet light from the sun. It's our own natural version of sunscreen or tint. So melanin is produced by cells known as melanocytes. And so our melanocytes produce this melanin. It then packages it into a vesicle or one of those carrying bubbles, if you remember that from our earlier chapters. Those are called melanosomes when they're specific to our melanocytes. And so they move into the cell processes of our melanocytes. Those can go to the surface and then release melanin to the skin. So certain concentrations of melanin can create skin characteristics such as freckles or moles. And so melanin production is largely determined by genetic factors. That's the main driver of how much melanin you're going to produce. Of course, exposure to light. So people that go out and tan, they're going to produce more melanin as well because it's your body's response to that exposure to light. And then certain hormones can also affect melanin production. But as I said, genetic factors are going to be largely responsible for this. So one concept to understand is that almost all races and people have the same number of melanocytes. So we have the same amount of cells, the same amount of melanin producing cells, but our genetic code and racial variations are determined by the actual amount and pigment of the melanin being produced. So let's say we all have 1,000 melanocytes in our skin, but person A, their melanocytes only produce 1 unit of melanin per minute, whereas person B, their melanocytes produce 10 units of melanin per minute. So of course, person B is going to end up having more melanin and darker skin, even though person A and B have the same amount of melanocytes. So it depends on their actual activity more than the number. Okay, we just said this above. Exposure to ultraviolet light, i.e. the sun, is how we stimulate our melanocytes to increase this production naturally. That's how we get our tan. And many genes are responsible for skin color. It's not quite as simple as just our melanocytes and how active they are. But if we have a complete lack of melanin and melanocytes, that's the disease or skin disorder known as albinism. So that's a lack of melanin. All right, we said our other major pigment is carotene. So carotene is lipid soluble. So remember, lipid is a fat, so it's fat soluble. So when we eat carrots, squash, other vegetables that have carotene in it, it's going to accumulate within our fat cells within that stratum corneum, as well as the dermis and subcutaneous tissue. So if we have a really large amount of carotene, we actually can start seeing the skin become orangish or yellowish. The other thing that we can talk about is the color of blood within our dermis. So if we have less blood flow into the dermis, that's going to cause a paler appearance for our skin because we have less blood going towards the surface. If we have more blood going towards the surface, then of course our skin is going to have a redder tone to it versus pale. Another blood-related change could be a lack of oxygen within the blood, and that would cause a bluish color of the skin because the blood was lacking oxygen. And that disorder or appearance is termed cyanosis. So cyan means blue, osis is abnormal condition. So an abnormal condition of blue skin is usually from lack of oxygen. Skin cancer is quite a common form of cancer, the most common actually. It's mainly caused by UV light exposure. So we said UV light exposure can stimulate melanin, but too much UV light exposure can stimulate cells to respond in a non-natural or malignant way. Of course, fair-skinned people are going to be more prone because the UV light is going to affect them more. So we can prevent this by limiting sun exposure. That's the big one. And if we are going to be in the sun, use sunscreen. So there's two different types of rays. We have UVA and UVB. UVA is what we associate with causing a tan, but it also is associated with our malignant melanomas or our tumors of the melanocytes. And then UVB rays are what actually cause our sunburn. A few different types of skin cancer to highlight. We have basal cell carcinoma. That's going to be all the way down in our basal layer. We have squamous cell carcinoma, which is going to be above our basal layer. And then we have malignant melanoma, which is going to be from our melanocytes or those melanin producing cells, and those are quite bad. And then here's just some examples. This is our malignant melanoma example. So a normal mole or freckle has pretty normal borders, or it's more or less a perfect circle or oval. These weird shapes and varying raised areas, same thing here and here, that's a bit odd. So usually if you see something that's not having normal borders, it looks funky in color, it's not raised evenly, that's the ones you want to get checked out. Okay, subcutaneous tissue. So this is going to be below our epidermis and dermis. It's our connecting or our connection or anchor for our skin down to the muscle and bone below it. We said hypodermis is another name for this. We just said that it attaches to the bone and muscle underneath, and our blood vessels that and nerves that spread all the way to the dermis go through the subcutaneous tissue as well. It's mostly adipose tissue, and about half of our body's fats are found in subcutaneous tissue. So where our subcutaneous tissue is and how much of it is very much determined by age and sex, as well as our diet. So our subcutaneous tissue distribution can change. Adipose tissue or fat tissue in this subcutaneous tissue is padding or cushioning, as well as insulation, so protection and insulation against heat loss. Subcutaneous tissue is often used to estimate our total body fat, and the total body fat kind of norms vary depending whether you're male or female. So for females, we have a higher body fat percentage, 21 to 30. For males, you have 13 to 25. You certainly will see people that are lower than this and higher than this. We don't want our body fat to get too low because fat does perform essential functions and provide essential materials. But you also obviously don't want it to get too high. That can be quite unhealthy. Okay, we're going to start talking about the accessory structures a little bit more. So I think this is a good time to actually go ahead and take a break. We're about halfway through. Let's make this part 1, and I'll come back with part 2 so that you guys can keep focused.